Nintendo didn't start the Game Genie lawsuit. Galoob did, and less than 2 months later, their own strategy backfired. On May 17, 1990, toy maker Lewis Galoob walked into a San Francisco federal court with an aggressive plan. They didn't just ask a judge to declare their upcoming gold video game accessory completely legal. Galoob even asked the court to stop Nintendo from modifying the NES system in a way that would make it incompatible with the Game Genie. Instead of backing down, Nintendo countersued under federal copyright law and secured a preliminary injunction that blocked US Game Genie sales. Nintendo argued that the altered audiovisual displays produced when Game Genie changed gameplay constituted unauthorized derivative works. What followed became a nearly 4-year fight over how far copyright could reach into a consumer's private use of a purchased game, and over a $15 million financial gamble that Nintendo ultimately lost. By 1990, Nintendo dominated the American home video game market and tightly controlled its NES ecosystem. Under those licensing arrangements, Nintendo controlled the manufacture of licensed NES cartridges and limited third-party publishers to releasing no more than 5 new titles per year. Every Nintendo licensed cartridge was locked to the system using the proprietary 10NES security chip. If a cartridge failed to provide the expected 10NES key response, the front-loading NES entered a repeating reset cycle, producing the familiar blinking power light. Then came the Game Genie. The device was developed at Britain's Codemasters by David Darling, Richard Darling, and engineer Edward Ted Caron. The invention's patent history reached back to a British filing in June 1989, nearly a year before the American lawsuit began. In North America, the marketing rights were split. Galoob prepared to launch the device in the United States, while Canadian distributor Camerica handled distribution north of the border. The American injunction hit a product with enormous advance demand. Immediately after announcing the Game Genie in May 1990, Galoob received orders for more than 550,000 units and expected to sell more than 1 million that year. By April 1991, while American sales were still blocked, the company said it had manufactured about 15,000 units it could not sell in the United States. Across the border, the story was completely different. Nintendo and game designer Shigeru Miyamoto also took Camerica to court in Canada, seeking an interlocutory injunction that would stop Game Genie sales there. The Canadian court refused. Nintendo appealed, and on May 24, 1991, the Federal Court of Appeal dismissed that appeal. While US sales remained blocked, Canadian players bought roughly 100,000 Game Genies in 10 months. Camerica leaned into the contrast, running the famous Thank You Canada campaign while the American legal fight continued. If you like forensic deep dives where gaming, hardware, and law collide, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me below, do you think the courts drew the right line between Nintendo's copyright and what customers could do with a game they had purchased? When you powered on an NES with a Game Genie attached, you didn't see the game's title screen. Instead, a custom menu appeared against a solid black background, presenting blank entry slots and a strange 16-letter alphabet. Instead of numbers, the system used 16 specific letters, starting with A, P, Z, and L, and running all the way through to V and N. Each letter represented a single 4-bit binary value. When a player typed a standard 6-character code from the included codebook, which contained around 1,600 different entries, the Game Genie's menu software unpacked the 24 encoded bits. 15 variable bits selected an address in the cartridge's memory, and 8 bits supplied the replacement value. The remaining encoded bit wasn't part of either number. The menu software used it behind the scenes to manage code entry. Because the highest address bit was always fixed to 1, every code pointed strictly into the cartridge's upper program ROM range, from address 8000 hex up to 4 Fs. Once decoded, the target address went straight into one of the Game Genie's hardware comparators, while the replacement byte waited in an adjacent register. During CPU reads from cartridge program ROM, all three comparator channels watched the bus in parallel, waiting for a match. The engineering behind the Game Genie was surprisingly straightforward. It never actually rewrote the game. The device contained no copyrighted Nintendo software. It didn't copy ROM data into storage, and it made zero permanent physical changes to the cartridge. It was an inline bus interceptor. The NTSC NES used a Rico 2A03 processor built around a 6502-derived CPU core. The processor communicated with the game cartridge across a 72-pin edge connector, with 36 contacts on each side. Whenever the CPU read a byte from the cartridge's program ROM window, whether an instruction or stored game data, it placed the requested address on its 16-bit address bus. In a standard setup, the cartridge saw that address, retrieved the stored byte from its read-only memory chip, and returned it across the 8-bit data bus. The CPU then read that byte and continued running the game. The Game Genie sat directly in that electrical path. Most pins, including power, ground, and the 10NES lines, passed straight through to the attached game untouched. The authentic cartridge still supplied the normal 10NES key response through the pass-through connection. The Game Genie did not need to emulate Nintendo's lockout key. During ordinary read cycles, the Game Genie let signals pass through unchanged. But when the CPU requested an address that matched one of the player's active codes, the Game Genie stepped in. During that specific read cycle, the Game Genie suppressed the cartridge's normal response and supplied its own replacement byte instead. The CPU read whatever byte appeared on the bus and continued running. The original cartridge was never altered, but the substitution existed on the bus while the system was running. At the preliminary injunction stage in 1990, Galoob relied on Section 117 of the Copyright Act, arguing that the adaptations produced through the Game Genie fell within the statute's exception for adaptations made as an essential step in using a computer program. That defense failed. In July 1990, the district court granted Nintendo a preliminary injunction, and in early 1991, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that order. Galoob had lost the first round. At the full trial, Galoob added two arguments it had not relied on at the preliminary stage. First, that the Game Genie did not create a derivative work at all, and second, that the player's private, in-home use was protected under fair use. Meanwhile, keeping the Game Genie off American shelves was becoming expensive for Nintendo. Under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65, a court ordinarily requires the party obtaining a preliminary injunction to provide security sufficient to cover costs and damages if the injunction is later found wrongful. In this case, Nintendo's bond began at $100,000. As the months passed and Galoob's backlogged orders continued to pile up, the court repeatedly raised the requirement. Nintendo's bond jumped from $100,000 to $5 million, and eventually to $15 million. Every month the Game Genie remained off shelves. Nintendo's potential exposure, if it ultimately lost, was climbing. The design also had to solve another problem built into advanced NES cartridges: bank switching. The NES processor could only directly view 32 kilobytes of cartridge program space at any single moment. To run larger, more complex titles like Super Mario Bros. 3, cartridge manufacturers built mapper chips onto the game boards. These mappers swapped different banks of ROM into the processor's viewable window during gameplay. This created a major collision problem for simple 6-character codes. A 6-character code intercepted its target address every time that address appeared on the bus, regardless of which ROM bank was currently swapped in. A code intended for one bank could fire against another, potentially causing glitches or crashing the game. Codemasters addressed that problem with the compare feature used by 8-character codes. 8-character entries added an 8-bit comparison value known as the compare byte. As with 6-character entries, one encoded bit belonged to the entry scheme rather than the actual address, replacement, or compare values. With an 8-character code active, matching the address alone was no longer enough. When the CPU requested the target address, the Game Genie sampled the byte the cartridge was trying to return and checked it against its stored compare value. If a different bank placed a different original byte at that address, the comparison failed and the Game Genie left the cartridge's response alone. This greatly reduced the chance of a code firing against the wrong ROM bank. On May 12, 1992, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office granted patent number 5,112,051 for this exact interception and comparison system to inventors Richard Darling, Edward Caron, and David Darling. In April 1991, the case went to a 2-week bench trial before District Judge Fern M. Smith in San Francisco. Judge Smith had recently handled another major Nintendo hardware dispute, granting Nintendo preliminary relief against Atari games in litigation arising from Atari and Tengen's efforts to reproduce Nintendo's 10NES lockout system. But the Game Genie presented a very different factual record. It did not contain a copied version of Nintendo's game program and could not function without the original cartridge. At trial, Nintendo presented an unusual argument. Beyond claiming lost sales, Nintendo argued that the Game Genie threatened what it called the Nintendo culture, a social ecosystem built around challenge, high scores, and peer achievement. Nintendo called game designer Gary Kitchen, who testified that making games easier would cause a tremendous reduction in enjoyment. Nintendo even brought in 2 behavioral psychologists to argue that bypassing design challenges would undermine player satisfaction and damage the entire video game market. Galoob countered with real-world consumer evidence. In February 1991, a market research firm surveyed 300 Canadian Game Genie owners aged 8 and older. The data showed that 72% of players said the Game Genie made games more fun. 52% said it made them more interested in buying new games, while only 2% said it made them less interested. Furthermore, 29% reported playing Nintendo games more often, compared to just 4% who played less. Nintendo attacked the survey, but the court noticed a glaring omission. Nintendo had its own Canadian sales figures and regular focus groups, yet produced zero empirical evidence showing that Game Genie sales had hurt game purchases. Nintendo's argument was further weakened by its own commercial practices. Nintendo actively published game hints, secret passwords, and cheat codes in its official Nintendo Power magazine. Nintendo also sold the NES Advantage, whose turbo controls and slow feature, which repeatedly pulsed the pause function, could change the way certain games were played. On July 12, 1991, Judge Fern Smith ruled for Galoob on Nintendo's copyright claims and dissolved Nintendo's preliminary injunction. In her written opinion, Judge Smith rejected Nintendo's theory, holding that harm to the so-called Nintendo culture was not cognizable under copyright law. She concluded that the Game Genie did not create an infringing derivative work because no independent, fixed work was ever created. In August 1991, more than a year after it was announced, the Game Genie finally went on sale in American stores. Nintendo appealed the trial verdict. On May 21, 1992, just 9 days after the Game Genie patent was granted, the 3-judge Ninth Circuit panel affirmed Galoob's victory. Judge Jerome Ferris wrote the principal opinion, while Judge Pamela Reimer concurred in the judgment. The court held that a derivative work must incorporate a protected work in some concrete or permanent form. In an alternative fair use analysis, which a later Ninth Circuit case would characterize as non-binding dicta, the panel wrote that a distributor of a copyrighted work cannot dictate how that work is to be enjoyed in the privacy of the home. Nintendo refused to give up. The company petitioned the United States Supreme Court to review the decision, but on March 22, 1993, the Supreme Court denied certiorari, leaving the Ninth Circuit's ruling intact. With the copyright victory finalized, the legal battle shifted to Nintendo's $15 million injunction bond. To estimate the damage caused by the injunction, the district court calculated that Galoob had lost at least 1.6 million Game Genie sales over the product's expected lifetime. Using an average net wholesale price of $34.28 and a 27.6% profit margin, the court calculated just over $15.138 million in lost profits. It added roughly $315,000 in lost interest and $480,000 in business restart costs. Because those damages exceeded Nintendo's bond, Galoob recovered the full $15 million, plus court-awarded costs. Nintendo appealed the payout, but in February 1994, the Ninth Circuit affirmed the award in full. The scale of pent-up demand became clear once the injunction disappeared. Galoob sold roughly 1 million Game Genies in the United States before the end of 1991. The Game Genie's victory is often remembered as a sweeping ruling that gave consumers an absolute right to modify their hardware. The actual legal precedent is far more precise. Technically, the Game Genie exploited a straightforward feature of the NES architecture. Cartridge program data traveled across an unencrypted digital bus, while the authentic game still handled Nintendo's separate 10NES authentication. Legally, the decisive point was different. The Ninth Circuit concluded that the altered audiovisual displays did not incorporate Nintendo's copyrighted work in the concrete or permanent form required by Nintendo's derivative work theory. The Game Genie could not generate those displays by itself. It still required the NES and the original game cartridge. The district court also expressly avoided deciding whether commercial use of a Game Genie in an arcade could produce a different result, as the case concerned private consumer use in the home. Later court decisions quickly outlined where those protections ended. In 1993, MAI Systems Corp. Peak Computer held that software loaded into RAM could be sufficiently fixed to constitute a copy under copyright law. Congress later limited the practical reach of that rule in the machine repair context. In 1998, it added Section 117(c), permitting certain temporary copies made solely while maintaining or repairing a lawfully owned or leased machine. Then, in 1998, MicroStar v. FormGen distinguished the Game Genie from a commercial CD containing permanent Duke Nukem-level files. Unlike the Game Genie's temporary alterations, those files existed independently and embodied detailed instructions for generating new audiovisual displays. The Ninth Circuit also clarified that Galoob's earlier fair use analysis had been dicta, because the finding that no derivative work existed had already resolved the case. Also in 1998, Congress enacted the DMCA's anti-circumvention regime. Section 1201 generally prohibits bypassing technological measures that control access to copyrighted works, although the law contains statutory exceptions, and the Librarian of Congress adopts additional temporary exemptions through recurring 3-year rulemakings. Current exemptions include specified circumstances, allowing restoration of certain lawfully acquired games for personal local play after required server support ends, as well as separate preservation activities by eligible libraries, archives, and museums. Galoob did not establish that everything beyond the cartridge pins legally belongs to the player. Its victory was narrower. Nintendo still owned the copyright in its games, while customers owned their consoles and lawfully acquired cartridges. On the facts before the court, the temporary alterations created by the Game Genie did not amount to infringing derivative works. That is what made the little gold adapter important. It did not create a universal right to modify software or bypass security. It showed that copyright ownership does not automatically give a company control over temporary modifications, like those the Game Genie produced during a customer's private use of a lawfully acquired game.